Mariya, thank you so much for doing this. Before I go on to introduce your illustrious background, if I can take just a few minutes to set the context of our conversation. This is a subject that is extremely personal because I've lived through this. I have for long fostered the idea of bringing my story and sharing it in the hope that it triggers conversations and in time it banishes the fear and discomfort that surrounds it. We are discussing female genital cutting. Mariya, you've been named one of the 6 experts on female genital cutting by newsdeeply.com. You have worked for over a decade in the anti-gender violence field, from research to policy, program development, and direct service. You've attained your Master of Social Work from San Francisco State University, and you went on to pursue a qualitative study titled Understanding Female Genital Cutting in the United States. You have been diligently working on the issue of domestic violence with a number of organizations. In 2015, you founded Sahiyo, an internationally recognized award-winning organization to empower Asian communities to end female genital cutting. You also sit on the inaugural steering committee to end female genital cutting with the US End FGMC network. In Massachusetts, you work with the Women's Bar Association to pass state legislation that would ban FGC and create education and outreach programs for survivors. The Manhattan Young Democrats named you 2017 Engendering Progress honoree, and ABC News did a special feature on you. You have been a prolific writer in fiction and non-fiction essays and short stories that have appeared on NPR, HuffPost, The Fair Observer, and a number of credible publications. Mariya, the first time that I spoke about FGC with a group of friends, I experienced a sense of release. It was almost cathartic. But I also sensed disbelief, despair, and huge discomfort. There are those who have perhaps never heard of this practice. Then there are those who have heard of it, but choose not to speak about it. And then there are those like us that have lived through this. So if we can begin this today with you just defining for us what in fact is female genital cutting.
Sure. Well, thank you, Farzana, so much for inviting me to speak and for that wonderful introduction. And this is an incredibly important topic for me, as well as you've spoken a little bit about my background. But it's also one because I grew up in it and I underwent it myself as 7 years old. And I want to just give that context first before I explain what female genital cutting is, because I think it's important to recognize that many girls who have undergone it actually don't know what they've undergone or even realize that what they've undergone is considered female genital cutting, or another term that it's referred to as female genital mutilation. But for purposes of our conversation, I will tend to refer to it as female genital cutting, or FGC. So according to the World Health Organization, female genital cutting involves all procedures involving cutting or removal of part of the external female genitalia for non-medical reasons. And there are various forms of it. The World Health Organization has actually categorized it in 4 types, but each one of these types are very broad in itself. So the type 1 is something that usually involves cutting or incision of the clitoral hood or part of the clitoris, but it's very broad. It could also include removal of all of the clitoral hood and also part of the clitoris. And then type 2, which is considered more severe, involves partial or total removal of the clitoris and the labia minora, with or without excision of the labia majora. So it's the, inner and outer lips of the female genitalia. And then type 3 is narrowing of the vaginal orifice with creation of a covering seal. So it's generally the most severe form. It's also known as infibulation, and it can involve removing all of the labia minora and all of the labia majora as well. And then there's a type 4, which is actually considered the other category. And this is really something that involves including anything that doesn't fit in types 1 through 3. So it can include pricking, piercing, cauterizing. And those are the 4 broad categories that are defined by the World Health Organization. Just to give you a little bit more information, of the statistics that we have on female genital cutting, about 90% of women and girls who undergo it undergo types 1 and 2. So type 3, which is the most severe form, only really accounts for about 10% globally. And I think that's just really important to recognize too.
Sure. Mariya, when I started to follow Sahiyo, I also got acquainted with a lot of survivor stories. And some of these stories resonated and I could identify completely. So it was almost most of us, my impression was, initial impression that I gathered was it happens in the age of between 7 to 9 years. And it's almost something that's led on by either your grandmother or an aunt or your mother. The backdrop is a dilapidated, dimly lit building where a elderly aunt normally answers the door, and she's the one who performs the practice. Immediately after that, there is a sense of celebration. While the survivor has gone through incredible amount of pain, confusion, and almost a sense of betrayal. However, as I went on to read and follow Sahiyo over the years, I also realized that this practice isn't skewed to a community or culture type, but in fact being practiced around the world in many geographies by indigenous communities. How right is that assessment?
That's correct. What's interesting is that when people have heard of female genital mutilation or cutting, they have often actually heard of it in connection to it happening within the African context or amongst African diaspora communities. And what is, it's a myth actually that it only happens within African communities or contexts. And I think what you're bringing up is the opposite, where you grew up knowing that this was something that happened within South Asian communities and within the Daudi Bohra community, which is the community we both grew up in, but it wasn't very much publicly acknowledged that it happened within this community. And I think that the stories you were describing are very typical of the stories that we hear from survivors who have experienced it within the Bohra community, but there are elements that also ring true for survivors from various different communities. One of the reasons, Sahiyo really engages is in storytelling, and a lot of our work is around the idea of collecting stories and making this a subject that was for so long known as taboo come out into the public, so that we are recognizing that it's okay to talk about that. It's important to talk about it, to share your stories, and to recognize there's a multitude of stories out there. So we have heard the stories of girls who are taken by their mothers or aunts under false pretenses, and the dilapidated building you spoke about, that's an element of a story we hear girls who have gone to Mumbai and who've had it done often talk about. But we've also had stories of girls who have told us they've been taken to healthcare professionals and had it undergone. We've had other stories of girls who are older and have to have it undergone. So within the Bohra community, it's typically done with around 7 to 9, but globally, it's done in many different communities. There is evidence now that it's being performed in over 92 countries globally, and that it can be done anywhere from birth to, adolescence to even adult women who undergo it. So it's very much a global issue. It is found in every continent in the world except for Antarctica. And it's just something that in the last few years that we're really recognizing how global this issue is.
It's interesting you say that, Mariya, because in one of the surveys that I was reading on one of your webinars, there was a mention that there was a research done with 400 women where about 80% of them said that they had undergone FGC, and 81% of them in fact said that they wouldn't want it to continue and they wouldn't do this practice with their own daughters. Mm-hmm. Then why is it that we still see the prevalence of this practice?
That's a good question. So Sahiyo, one of the first things we did when we came together was we realized that we needed to do a larger scale study to understand how prevalent it was within the Dadi Bora community. And really previous to that, there were a couple of small scale studies, but we wanted to do something just to get a larger number. And we did this small study where we had women who grew up in the Bora community globally take part, and we had over 400 women take part in it. And the statistics you refer to, so we found that we analyzed about 384 women's data after we collected it all. And we found of that number, 80% of the women had undergone female genital cutting, which confirmed for us that it was prevalent, which is something that we anecdotally knew, but we didn't have evidence really. But we also found that 81% said they did not want it to continue on to the next generation. And that was surprising to us. And at the same time, though, what it made us realize is that female genital cutting, or FGC, or katna as it's called in the Dadi Bora community, it's a social norm, meaning that it's been justified in all these ways. And that one way in which it's continuing is that because it's been justified, there's this sense of belief that even if you don't want it to continue, you think others in your community are continuing it, so it's being continued. There's a term in social psychology, pluralistic ignorance, and that's basically what we found was happening. And part of it was because no one was talking about this. And if no one is talking about it, then of course no one knows that people are suffering physical, emotional, sexual consequences of undergoing this. People don't know that other people don't want it to continue. And so the first step in terms of, combating that pluralistic ignorance is storytelling, is coming out in the open, is speaking about that. And that's really the basis of, again, our work and why we do storytelling, was because of that research, because we found that there was this huge population that didn't want it to continue. We were like, how do we break the silence? And so that's really, that's our theory of change. And that's what we recognize we need to work towards too.
That's very, very interesting. Again, Mariya, because I personally believe that these kind of practices go back institutionally in terms of legitimizing fear. And there is such shame around it as well that makes it difficult for people to have conversations on this. In fact, we are discouraged, systematically discouraged to have any kind of discourse. And what I also find interesting is the reference you made in terms of it being more than just a physical violation. Because prima facie, this practice does come across as violation of physical well-being, but in fact, it's almost like an onion peel where there are so many peels that you can keep layering, and those are so deeply entrenched with fear, with purity culture, with patriarchy, gender roles, promiscuity, shame. And it's therefore so important to be able to see this with a much wider prism, more holistically, that this is not just physical violation, but it is emotional violation, it's mental violation. And in your experience of working with survivors, what do you believe is one of their biggest challenges to overcome?
Oh, it's Such an important question, but very hard question. I think it's important to also recognize that survivors, the repercussions of FGC vary from survivor to survivor. And of the stories that I've heard personally through our blog, in support groups, I think what always I come away with is the emotional impact that it has, regardless of a person's background, the severity they've undergone, how they underwent it. That emotional impact is something that lasts a lifetime, and it comes across in many different ways. We've had stories of women who don't remember they've been cut, which is actually very common because trauma, the way that your brain protects you, that's one of the things, it switches off. And so we've had stories of women who did not remember they were cut, and who, until someone else told them they were cut, didn't even realize it. But in determining that, or in finding out that information, it was almost like they were going through a PTSD again too. And for some women, it was almost like piecing together pieces of a puzzle. Like they were recognizing or wondering if certain impacts that they've had in their sexual lives are a result of it. And it's something that, unfortunately, because there's not enough research around the sexual impact, particularly amongst type 1, we don't really know. But again, sexuality is very much connected to your emotional state and to your mind. So there is that. That's one thing that I think across communities, across individuals, that I am often come away with, is that emotional impact. But again, this is something that affects people physically, sexually, in many different ways. And it's important to recognize that every survivor is going through their own journey in terms of what they're dealing with.
In my case, if I can just use my reference just for a few minutes here, and perhaps the analogy sounds a bit absurd, but I'll go with this analogy. It's like childbirth. You forget the physical pain because the emotional sense is so heightened with the joy. Similarly here, the physical pain's forgotten. I don't remember that. But the sense of deceit at the hands of my mother has been huge. Yeah. But again, I completely recognize that my mother came from a generation that was less educated, less informed, less encouraged, perhaps not encouraged at all to speak their mind. But again, it's the same woman who today hasn't enforced on me or have expressed those views for me to practice it on my daughter. So I do believe that there is a huge hope of change. And just the same, Mariya, because Sahiyo is so dedicated to ending the practice of FGC, in your opinion, how far are we from the day that this is something that we won't see happen? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but some kind of
today. Social change takes time. It takes a lot of work. There's a lot of work to still be done. But
how far, perhaps, sorry to interrupt, but if perhaps you can tell us, how far have you come from the time that you started?
I want to recognize also that there have been women and researchers, even within the Bora community, that have been bringing this to the world's attention, or who have been trying to, prior to Sahiyo existing as well. And I want to also just acknowledge all of the women from past generations and men from other communities that have been working on this topic in various cultures and communities too, just to recognize that this is something that has been ongoing, and there's been a lot of amazing, important work being done for decades. Having said that, I do think that we've seen a lot of progress within the last 5 years as well, in terms of acknowledging that this happens within many Asian countries and communities. And that's something where we're seeing, from the largest levels, from looking at systemically, even looking at the UN in terms of measuring FGMC. So there's something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which have come out from the UN, and it's a measuring type of, the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework which every country who signs on to the SDGs, they're responsible for making progress towards those goals. And then there's the SDG number 5, which is specific to female genital cutting. And it's specific to decreasing FGC globally. And I'm bringing that up because prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a platform called the Millennial Development Goals, and that was a similar framework towards measuring achievement towards various social ills globally. And within the Millennial Development Goals, they did have a target to decrease female genital cutting globally, but it was only amongst what they considered relevant countries. So countries that had high prevalence rates, which were mostly within sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. So at that time, it was only about, I think, 29 to 30 countries. The SDGs, this new framework, actually accounts for the fact that it's global. And so it's no longer just counting the estimates within those 29, 30 countries. It's actually globally, which is a huge, huge deal because it's recognition that this is a global issue. And that's progress in itself. So I just want to mention that in terms of the highest level, but then at the lower level, in terms of communities and individuals, we are hearing more stories. More survivors are sharing their stories. More people are coming out to publicly say that we shouldn't do this. And that's huge. And I do think that we are getting to that tipping point that we need. There's research that shows once you get 25% of a community to reach a certain tipping point, that's when you see change within social norms. And so I feel like we're getting to that tipping point. And it's just so I want to recognize that I don't think I want to be hopeful that it ends in my lifetime, but I also want to recognize that change is happening. And I think we need to celebrate that change and those small wins along the way.
Sure, of course. Legislatively, what does it look like? Are more and more countries warming up to the idea of putting a ban to this practice? Is that something that's a huge hurdle to cross?
That is, and I think legislation is important because it's a framework in which countries can, and it's a tool that you can use for prevention. And we are seeing more and more countries passing legislation within the United States. It's a very long story, but our federal statute was actually challenged, and so our Congress is working on a stronger piece of legislation, but individual states have been passing state laws. And so that's been amazing to see in the past few years. Within Africa, most countries have a ban. It's challenging within Asia. That's because Asia has only come on the map in terms of FGC being performed, and it's a very different circumstance where it's actually protected in various countries. And so we're seeing people challenging those social norms, challenging that legislation. In India, you're seeing groups that are working towards passing a state law that are really urging the Supreme Court in India to have a ban on female genital cutting. And in that context, it's being challenged as, are we protecting girls from harm versus a religious minority right? So you're seeing different challenges, but you're seeing overall that the conversation at a global level is increasing. And again, that's the first step in the right direction.
Apart from Africa, are there any other countries that have gone ahead and banned the practice?
Yeah, there are many countries that have laws against it. I don't know off the top of my head the number, but for instance, in Europe, there are many countries that have legislation against female genital cutting, recognizing that it happens in various countries there. Australia does as well. There was a court case that really brought it to light a few years ago, and there's attempts to strengthen the legislation within Australia too. So it is something that you are seeing in many different countries.
And one of the stories that led me to further read about was Khatna packages, travel packages. So it was almost as if you could do a Khatna tour where you would have, so if it was a practice that was forbidden in the country of residence, you could actually take a trip down to India for 4 to 5 days, have this practice done, and then come back again. So that was extremely disturbing to know that they were actually selling it as a package for tourists who couldn't
I
do it.
have not heard of the Kutna packages, but it is very common to hear. There's a term which I don't like using, but it's vacation cutting. And the idea that girls are taken to various countries or countries of origin to have their FGC done. And it sounds like this is what the Kutna package is that you've heard.
Yes. That's right.
And I wasn't aware of that term, but it can be more complicated than that too, where it is, in my circumstance, it wasn't that my family took me to India to have it done specifically. It was that we went to India to visit relatives, and it was the summer that I was 7 that it happened for me. But it is a growing concern that as countries are creating laws and policies, that might be a repercussion of or unintended consequence that they'll be taken to other countries. However, there also are laws. For instance, in the United States, there is a vacation cutting provision, meaning that if a girl is taken out with the intent to have that done in another country, a person can still be prosecuted. So that's one thing that is to be aware of. And as we're talking about legislation just in general, I think law is an important framework, but I don't think law alone will end this practice. I do think it's really important to recognize we need community education. We need to work in a very multi-sectorial approach because we're really looking at changing, again, social norms, and you need to have community dialogue and education, and that's it's much more important than legislation, but legislation does help to reinforce that something is not acceptable within a community. But it's that changing of mindsets that's really, really what we're trying to do.
I completely agree. And I just think it becomes even more incumbent upon us to be able to come out and share these stories, because change can only be brought out if there are conversations happening around it. We've got to be somewhere, perhaps muster enough courage to share our stories, and hopefully that should lead to change. Mariya, you also touched upon something which I have questioned several times, and that is the role of men. Mm-hmm. How important is the role of men in this practice of FGC?
Involving men is very important, and it's something that Sahiyo really strives to do as well, because we really look at FGC as a community issue, and we're really looking at it as something that we are trying to show that FGC affects, obviously, the survivor, the woman who undergoes it, but also it affects the entire community. Particularly, we have stories from men who talk about hearing how it impacted their mothers. We have stories from men who've talked about how it's impacted their wives and their own marital relationships. We have stories of brothers who have talked about learning that it happened to their sister, and then just wondering if that was part of what divided them in terms of their relationship. It's something that we need to recognize that as a community, we have to come together to really work to make sure that no one is harmed, and that, future daughters, future sisters, future mothers are protected from this form of gender-based violence, which can impact their lives in many different ways throughout their life. So it's something that we work very hard to make sure that men's voices are heard, and that they're allies, and that they also are sharing their stories. Because particularly for a very long time within the Bora community, and this isn't true for every community, but it is an element that you find often. But for a very long time within the Bora community, men were not aware of this issue, or it was something that was considered a women's issue. And that's changing, though. In particular, I think it's changing because of social media, because of just technology, because people are talking about this. And so now the younger generations, everyone knows about this issue, it seems like. But that's a huge cultural shift too, where you see from, just a decade ago, men not being very aware of this to now recognizing that men are aware and they can be allies and help protect future generations.
And that's reassuring. And again, here, if I can use an anecdote of my personal story where my father was an extremely protective father. He was extremely careful about the way we were brought up. But this was one of those issues that he was almost sidelined on by my aunt, by the women in the family, because this was something that men didn't get into. And like I said, systematically, this is devised to be so patriarchy in nature. And that's why it's thriving. And it's also sprinkled with fear and constant, it's almost, you can't be questioning the establishment, and you can't be questioning therefore the practice.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is intrinsically one of the reasons why men perhaps didn't know enough about it, didn't know about it at all. And if those who knew about it perhaps couldn't say very much. But it's reassuring to know that that's changing, because that's important. They are also stakeholders in this process of change.
I agree.
Yeah.
Completely.
But yeah, we possibly cannot not reflect on the times that we are living in, which is the pandemic. It's really, really disheartening when one reads that across the world, we are seeing a huge surge in domestic violence during this period of lockdown.
Yeah.
There are some estimates that UN has put out there saying that they're expecting about 31 million new cases to emerge if the lockdown continues for another 6 months. And that's a hugely staggering number. What and how does FGC fit within the spectrum of the pandemic?
That's a great question. And I was actually listening to a webinar the other day, and it was, right now it seems like there might be a difference in terms of the impact of COVID within African communities, within Africa, and amongst Asian communities. And one of the things is, it was I think last week even, there was a headline that came out, some initial findings from an organization within Somalia that that it had increased significantly, or FGC had increased significantly there, because people were at home and they were taking advantage of the fact that girls were not at school, so they could have time to heal, and cutters were going door to door to both, their economic well-being depended on this business, and so they were looking to see if they could do performing cutting on girls. So you are hearing that. Then anecdotally within Asia, you're not hearing that as much. And the speakers on the webinar, and one of them was my fellow co-founder, Arifa. So I should mention that I co-founded Sahiyo with 4 other women too. And Arifa was on that webinar, and she was also, me and her have had some conversations on this issue, what we've been hearing. But anecdotally, we're not hearing an increase of FGC amongst the Bora community during this time. And we think there might be several reasons. One part might be that it tends to be more medicalized now. And so as, hospitals and healthcare professionals are overwhelmed with COVID, that's sort of becoming secondary. But also the fact that within the Bora community, it doesn't have to happen at 7, but 7 is sort of the minimum age. So people could potentially be waiting a few months or however long to have it done. So I think that what we're seeing is that it might actually be, and a couple of other guest speakers from other countries within Asia were saying that they feel that it might be being postponed too. And I think within Asia too, we do see it happen as a more medicalized version, and we do see type 1 and much more, type 1 and type 2 much more often than we see type 3. And because of those circumstances, and there's a very strong religion connection within Asia to this practice, it might be, again, there's no official high-level data on this, but anecdotally, it might be that it might be actually halted right now due to the pandemic. But so it's interesting to see sort of the difference that is emerging amongst the different continents. And what is occurring here. But I think we'll really see the impact after the pandemic is over and once we're able to really collect more data on this.
Sure.
What I do want to say, though, even if the prevalence rate might be different, the fact that there's survivors and seeking out support, that is something that is having a huge impact right now. And Sahiyo's had a few support groups, and some of the things that we're hearing is this sheltering in place, this pandemic type of atmosphere that we're having is actually triggering some trauma responses and being locked down and feeling like having a lack of control. And then the fact that it's harder to seek out support right now in terms of a mental health professional or just to be able to chat with others. That is an impact that we are seeing in terms of being able to receive services if you need it as a survivor.
I mean, yes, this pandemic has been unprecedented for many reasons, and this is something perhaps that if we can reach out stories, more and more stories, hopefully somewhere we are able to just reassure and give comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Mariya, we can go on, but I'm also cognizant that we have a time limit. So thank you so much for doing this. Kudos to your team, to you for having done such wonderful work, and may you continue to make a difference, change lives, and hopefully we come to that point in our lifetimes where we could probably see the end to this practice. If I can just end this conversation on a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people."
That's a wonderful quote to end with. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.